Hope you're all well nourished and ready for our panel. We're grateful to start off the second half of our day with a panel of local faith leaders from a variety of spiritual and religious traditions. I'm going to start off by offering a brief bio of each speaker. Then I'll invite each of them to take a turn speaking on our conference theme from their perspective of their particular faith tradition. Finally, we'll open up to Q&A for all of you. So as they're speaking, if you have questions that start to bubble up, please feel free to save them and ask them at the end. So a couple of bios. Reverend Stephanie Johnson, furthest to my left, is an Episcopal priest and rector at St. Paul's in Riverside, Connecticut. She offers workshops, clergy training, and retreats on eco-theology, preaching on climate change and grief in the face of the climate emergency, and congregational greening. For 20 years, prior to her ordination in the Episcopal Church, Stephanie worked as an environmental planner and educator. Following her ordination, Reverend Johnson worked for the Episcopal Bishops of New England, providing support in reducing congregational energy use and environmental ministries. Reverend Steve Kanji-Rule, a little bit over, two down from me, is an ordained Zen Buddhist minister through the Zen Peacemaker Order and has served as a Buddhist advisor to the Yale Buddhist student community for the past 10 years. He received his Master of Divinity degree from Harvard and is a faculty member of the Shogaku Zen Institute. He also serves as the Buddhist spiritual life advisor at Deerfield Academy and teaches independently through his Touch the Earth Cyber Sangha. I'm keeping these bios pretty brief so that you can hear from them rather than me. Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, three down, is the Howard M. Holtzman Jewish chaplain at Yale, and he works in the Slifka Center just down the hill. He comes from a background as diverse as Yale's Jewish community, a childhood at Reform Temple Micah in DC, formative years studying at the Orthodox Yeshiva Ma'al, is that right? Pardon me, in northern Israel, and rabbinic ordination at the Conservative Jewish Theological Seminary. From 2008 to 2018, Jason taught on the faculty of the Hadar Institute, working to create classrooms, conversations, and communities that bring Torah to life by drawing on the fullness of students' lives. Last but not least, A.R. Malik, right here, is an award-winning journalist, educator, and cultural organizer. In June 2019, he was appointed lecturer and associate research scholar at the Yale Divinity School. He also serves as a program coordinator at Yale University's Council on Middle East Studies and responsible for developing curricula and partnerships with public schools to promote better cultural, language, and religious literacy about the Middle East to educators and students alike. AR also serves as director of the Muslim Leadership Lab, an innovative student leadership program being incubated at the Dwight Hall Center of Social Justice at Yale. All of these people have biographies that extend way beyond what I've said, but let's leave it there for now. Now that you've gotten to know a little bit about them, let's hear from you. You have 5 minutes to speak. I'm just going to very impolitely make a purring sound into a microphone. And that's a gentle way of saying enough is enough. So, Stephanie, would you like to start? Okay.
Thank you, Chris. And yeah, I said for sure keep me to 5 minutes because I could go on about this topic for a long period of time. I just want to say that I would not be here without Mary Evelyn and John. 15 years when I walked into the doors of this school, I had no idea that my life would be transformed into a ministry of ecological faith and ministry and climate change response. And when I first met Mary Evelyn, I think God invited us into a conversation that I never knew was going to happen. And because of the two of you, my life has been changed. And I hope that other folks have learned from me because of you. And Mary Evelyn said that, I hope this doesn't count for my time, but I just really want to do a public acknowledgement. Chris, you're going to give me an extra minute on this tribute because, anyway, so Mary Evelyn said this morning that her students were her children, and I felt that love every single time I walked into your classroom or into your office, and sometimes in tears, because I felt like I was your child. And I am eternally grateful for what you have done, not only for me, but for so many other people. Thank you from the deepest part of my heart. So crocuses. 4 weeks ago, the crocus came up in my town, and I was walking to my church, and I started to cry. I cry when they come out at the right time of year because I have the gratitude of the creation of the earth and the beauty of new life. But I cried 4 weeks ago in deep despair. Crocuses. I feel it in the deepest part of my heart. My body gets uncomfortable when the weather is wrong. I recently had someone come up to me in tears saying, the elm trees are blooming. My bees are going to die. Ecological grief is what we're living with, and we feel it, or I feel it, in the deepest part of my soul and my being. It's a physical reaction to the changing times and the climate emergency. 15 years ago, when I started here, Jim Antal, a UCC minister, said, if every fourth sermon is not about climate, every sermon in the future will be about grief. 15 years ago. And I lived with that statement, and we are living with that reality now. It's hard to imagine the depth of our despair, but it's also wonderful to live into the hope of the possibilities of the future. And so I live in a place of hope, and I know some of the questions are going to be about how do we find hope and resiliency, so I'm not going to go into it too far, but I just want to sort of acknowledge that I have always lived in hope. It's my Christian faith that leads me to hope and new creation and new possibilities after the crucifixion and to the resurrection. I also live in a place of anticipatory grief. I'm really good at anticipating grief in the future. And part of the sadness of that is I live in anticipatory grief for those who come after me. My son is here, and if he has children, his children will live into the climate emergency in ways we can't imagine it, and I grieve that today on behalf of them. And so I anticipate their grief, and I anticipate the future of grief. So what am I doing about it? I'm learning from you. I'm praying on it. I'm acting on it. And I have been working on a project in my heart for 15 years about how rituals and prayers and music and gatherings can help us survive and, dare I say, thrive in the midst of the grief and give us hope. And so it's a 15-year project. It started when I walked in the doors here, and it will continue in the years ahead. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But I just wanted to frame that as anticipatory grief and the possibility of community giving us the hope, but also letting us sit in the sadness of today and for future generations.
No purring. Thank you. Thanks very much. Jason, would you like to go next?
I hope I'll get double purrs since we missed out the first time. Thank you, that was so beautiful. I want to thank Chris and everyone who put so much into gathering us today. And also I want to thank the source of all life who graces us with wisdom for the opportunity to live and to reflect and to grieve, which is part of living. There's a story in 4 parts that I'm going to try to tell you in 5 minutes that is how one kind of enters into the waters of grief, Jewishly, around the climate, and then how one allows those eddies to pull and push and hopefully cleanse us. And each part kind of builds on and also unsays the part before it. The first place we start is that the structure of our standard kind of climate crisis predictions and calls to action is exactly parallel to the structure of the biblical prophecy of doom. Right? If you take the biblical case of idolatry and replace it with carbon emissions, right? Watch the following unfold. You're all doing this thing. You think it's actually part of sustaining your life. In fact, it's destroying your life. You think it's okay. it's not, and you think it's not okay, but it's actually really not, and you have to find a way to stop. Other people are telling you it's okay. You heed their advice at your own peril. And if you don't, the combination of the accumulated sins of previous generations added to yours will initiate a crisis which will begin as ecological and then become a full-blown economic and political one and end with your inability to live on the land. Then things get interesting because scene 2 is that the rabbis call BS on the prophetic tradition in 2 senses. The first is, especially with Purim coming up on Sunday night, they say that when Achashverosh took off his ring and gave it to Haman, he accomplished what 48 prophets and 24 prophetesses couldn't, which is to get the Jews to fast and pray. Right? Already in Jeremiah, God is lamenting that no one listens to the prophets. And the rabbis actually thought the prophecy was completely ineffective as a moral and rhetorical tool. And that's why every page of the Talmud reads differently. And the prophets consoled, right? Isaiah said after the destruction of the first temple, the source of life. This was just a moment of anger. I will gather you to me in comfort everlasting. I promise, as I promised for the floodwaters of Noah, that I will never do this again. And then God did it again, and the temple was sacked. And the rabbis imagined God not consoling in this moment, but asking in a heartbreaking dialogue to the angels, how do human beings grieve? Angels say they take off their shoes, and God says, I will do that. The person sits in silence, and God says, I will do that. Angels say, and human beings weep, and God says, and I will do that. So there's a resistance to the sense of agency, that we can change it. Rabbis think they can't rebuild the temple, and they're right. They live under Roman Empire. And there's a resistance of the easiness of consolation. There's a centering of grief, what William James would have called the twice-born soul. Sorry for quoting a Harvard scholar here in these halls. But not in a kind of existential, ahistorical way, but historically, post certain human events, the destruction of the environment or the destruction of the temple, we live in a world of grief. That's scene 2. Scene 3 is that grief is a teleological process with a goal, which is allowing us to live a flourishing life and love again without someone or something who is completely indispensable to us. And so if we take the frame of grieving the Earth's fecundity and biodiversity seriously, it means that our end goal, just taking immanent to the frame of grief, would be a human life that is flourishing and full of joy without the biodiversity of the Earth. And all the senses of treason and betrayal that come with successful grieving. Is it a betrayal to get married again? To start a second family? To love again? Those questions should haunt us if we're doing it right. And here the rabbinic tradition, I'll just share, it's haunting and fascinating. It says if someone is reciting their learning, which they maintain as an oral tradition, they stop to say, what a beautiful tree. They've done something terrible. Or the word briot, which derives from the Hebrew root bet resh aleph, which is a verb for creation reserved to God. In rabbinic Hebrew, it doesn't mean creatures. It means human beings. There's a radical disinterestedness in the natural world, which might actually be a spiritual resource for us going forward. And then scene 4 is that in Jewish grieving, it's unseemly and it's forbidden to prepare for someone's death and eulogy while they're still alive. We can't be anticipating what we would say. We have to be horrified at this prospect and also know that we can and will flourish through and after it.
Thank you. And Chris, thank you. Thanks to the conference organizers. I'm glad to be here. I originally was going to share 10 minutes of notes that I jotted down with you, so I'm cutting that in half, and I hope it won't be too disconnected. I'm happy to do that, no problem. So as Chris said, I'm a Zen Buddhist practitioner, and also I'm someone who approaches the topic from several different angles. I was involved in the very first Earth Day in 1970, and I vividly recall seeing a film at a conference that day on something that was very concerning, called the greenhouse gas problem. That was 53 years ago. And since then, nothing has been done. And as we all know, the problem has worsened considerably, very terribly. Now, I also took an Earth Systems course as an undergraduate in college, and so I know what albedo means. I know how feedback loops work. I know what the runaway greenhouse effect is. So I bring some basic scientific understanding to what we call green Buddhism, which is the application of Buddhist practices and principles such as interconnectedness and caring for all beings to the current environmental crisis. And I've also participated in socially engaged Buddhism. Among other actions, in 2014, I marched with 400 other folks in the People's Climate March in New York City. And I've also made life decisions that allow me to live very simply in accord with Buddhist economics, very lightly on Mother Earth. And yet, through all these decades, in my growing alarm about the environmental apocalypse that is now unfolding, I've moved through a deeply embodied grief and hopelessness, disgust and despair. And because of my spiritual practice, I've reached what I feel to be a place of strength and clarity. Now, what Buddhism calls the three poisons of craving, anger, and delusion feed both the secular materialism and the pietistic, dogmatic religiosity that contribute to the environmental crisis. In the realm of secular materialism, the poison of craving feeds consumerism and worship of profit. The poison of anger feeds the toxic politics that impede progress on environmental issues. The poison of delusion feeds the mistaken notion that humans are separate from nature and that the earth can be endlessly exploited. In the realm of pietistic, dogmatic, religious institutions, the poison of craving feeds lust for power. And we see this in the Christian nationalist movement, among many other places. The poison of anger feeds an embittered, self-righteous, holier-than-thou attitude. And the poison of delusion feeds institutions of hierarchy, sham holiness, and superstition that also deny the present danger of the environmental crisis. Both secular materialism and dogmatic religion desacralize the world. When I say that as a Zen Buddhist minister, I'm focusing on healing the planet by promoting the transformation of human consciousness, what I mean is that I'm working to restore our sense of the sacred. That sense of the sacred, which is the authentic, mystical source of all the world's beautiful religious traditions, including those represented here today. I'm focusing on helping people awaken to the sacred interconnectedness of life on earth. People who experience the earth as sacred will not destroy it. People who experience the earth as sacred will not destroy it. Now, if that sounds naive, let me say that along with the terrible destruction that's occurring now, the mass extinctions, the melting ice caps, the rising seas, the sizzling temperatures, the droughts and wildfires, all of that, along with that, the transformation of human consciousness and the reclaiming of the sacred also is occurring. We may not see it often because the establishment media tends to ignore it, but it is happening, and in fact, this conference is part of it. We're witnessing the frenzied collapse of the old order, a society built on militarism, class oppression, systemic racism, sexism, ageism, a desacralized society, falling apart through its own rotten corruption, and it's being challenged. The Buddhist teacher and systems analyst Joanna Macy calls this the great unraveling, and it's unleashing a tremendous amount of death energy. I'm not talking about death itself, which is a natural process. I'm talking about death energy, apocalyptic, violent, cynical, suicidal. But simultaneously, a new vision is emerging of how we can live on this earth in a sacred way. It's a new vision that involves a transformation of mind, of heart, of spirit, of consciousness. And it counters the death energy that's now rampant and running amok. And Buddhist teacher and systems analyst Joanna Macy calls this the Great Turning. And that's exciting. Am I being purred at? Okay, I'll wrap it up. Thanks, Chris. So just very quickly, I'm purring out here. The question is, can the Great Turning happen quickly enough? I just want to say in terms of hope, Buddhism has a problem with hope because hope distracts us from the present moment and projects us into an imaginary future that doesn't exist. And not only that, but hope is conditional. Hope says, if such and such happens, I want this desired outcome. So I reject hope. I reject hope. I embrace faith. Faith is unconditional, and faith says, I believe this will happen. My faith is in the life force. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You won't be able to purr if I use that. All right, all right. Thank you to the organizers and to my fellow panelists. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The topic that was offered to us today is, I think, particularly not just prescient, but I think it touched a certain nerve for me. I lost my mom last year in May, and so this year has really been a year of contending with grief. And my mother wasn't the first person close to me who passed away, certainly not during the pandemic. But I think it brought together all the elements of what does grieving mean, and what does grieving mean as a spiritual practice. And I think my beloved colleagues have spoken about that. And then I think when we multiply that grief at this moment of social, political, and economic fracture, climate emergency, where literally the ground is disappearing from under our feet, I think this idea of grief takes on a greater resonance and theme. So I begin from that very personal place, and using that, want to offer 2 or 3 perspectives from within the Islamic tradition. In the second chapter of the Quran, we're told this kind of dramatic story that God, in God's wisdom, announces to the angelic realm that there will be a new creation, and this will be the human being. And the angels immediately respond, will you create a new creation that will undoubtedly bring fasad and bloodshed? Fasad meaning corruption. It's a fascinating word in the Arabic language. That will bring corruption and bloodshed to the earth. At that point, God could disagree with this. Said, no, I'm creating the human being with a particular aspiration or with a particular perfect outcome. But God doesn't actually disagree with the angels. God merely says, I know that which you do not know. And so this idea that our insertion into creation itself was already noted very early on by the angelic realm as being something that would cause imbalance, corruption, fitna and fasad in Arabic, and bloodshed, I think sort of indicates the challenge that the human being faces. The Quran tells us that we were created with a divine perfection, and we become through our actions the lowest of the low, asfal as-safilin, and that we can only recover by re-establishing some sort of balance. and that the earth and creation itself offer a witness to the Creator about us. On the last day, when we're called before the majesty of God, the earth will speak about what we did upon it. It will testify, it will weep, it will tell us all of the things that we did to harm it and to hurt it. The Quran reminds us that around us are communities like yourselves with complexity, and we know this now to be more than true. So the communities of animals and creation itself, and perhaps cells and plant life and the trees that speak to each other, will all rally around and say, this is what was done to us. That imbalance was brought in. So I think we are living through a moment, the climate catastrophe, if it's nothing else, then it is a bearing witness to the imbalance that we collectively as human beings have caused upon the earth. And I think for me that kind of relationship is really important, because there's a saying of the Prophet Muhammad which we often will repeat in times of great trial and tribulation, and that is that the Prophet advised that if you intend to plant a tree, or you have a seed which you want to put into the earth, and the trumpet sounds to indicate the beginning of the judgment hour, plant the tree anyways.
Yeah.
Plant the seed anyways. I might suggest that the trumpet's been blown. I might suggest that the hour or an hour has come. I think if we don't see what is happening around us as not just a witness but a judgment on our place on the earth, then I think we're sort of missing the point. And yet, and I understand, Reverend, when you talk about hope, I think in the Islamic conception, the hope is not in our desire of what will happen, but an abiding hope that the divine plan is unfolding in the way that the divine wishes, and that it is our role and duty to do what we can in the present moment to try to achieve mercy, justice, and compassion, knowing that the outcome is not in our hands. It never has been. And yet we are empowered to do in the now and in the moment, because there is in our tradition, and I'll close on this, a sense of radical personal responsibility. We are made into communities, nations, and tribes, as the Quran said, so that we may know one another. And yet, on the last day, we stand before the Creator alone, with ourselves, our deeds, our actions, what we wanted to do, what we could do. And I think that kind of call to radical personal responsibility in the amelioration of the condition that we're in, but it seems so large. So what do we do? Systemic change is needed. We understand that. But at an individual and personal level, there has to be kind of a personal commitment and a deeply radical individual commitment to dealing with this moment when the judgment, at least of the planet and of the biosphere, is upon us. And I think that is tied to grief, because I think that is a huge responsibility. And the horse is bolted, and the hour is late. And yet, not but, and yet, we are here. We have life, sentience, freedom, apparently, to act and to do. And I think there's a call from the divine to do.
Thanks to all four of you. I have some questions prepared, but I'd be much more interested in hearing yours. So if, I think everybody would. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and we'll have Noah walk around with a microphone. Yeah, great. Okay.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And my question is based off of Reverend Steve and Professor Malik, your, I guess both of what you were speaking, but this notion of hope and bearing witness. So how is like the condition of hope or the notion of hope, how can it be a weapon to blindness or our responsibility to bear witness?
I mean, I appreciate the question, but I would love to hear Stephanie and Jason on this question of hope and responsibility, because I would love to hear how your traditions sort of deal with that dilemma.
Right. I mean, I think one of the questions that Chris had presented was sort of greenwashing, the idea that religion can be greenwashing as much as corporations can be greenwashing, right? And so I do think hope can be used as a crutch not to move forward, to be paralyzed, or to say, well, something else will happen. Or there are people who have hope that the world will end, right? There's a Christian theology in some places that the end times are what we aspire to, and so the world destruction is actually God's plan, and Jesus will come back, right? So there's a type of hope that is contrary to my theology. So I think that there's this broad sense of what hope can be within all traditions. I mean, I don't want to, Christianity is not a monolith, right? From my perspective, I have a friend who often says, I am not an optimist, but I am hopeful in Jesus. And so I'm not optimistic that climate change will stop. I'm not optimistic that the world's climate emergency will necessarily end. I've often come to the conclusion in my own reflections that humanity may disappear from the earth, but the hope I have is that the hope in God is, and the belief in God is that the world will still continue even if humanity is no longer here. And so that's a theology that I've sort of worked through for a very long time. So the hope is not a greenwashing, but just a deep sense that God is with us in whatever it is that transpires, that God has never left us. And in my theology, it's the idea that even in the darkest of the crucifixion, Jesus was in conversation and calling out, and there was the hope at the end. And so I think there's that transformative moment of hope. So I just reflecting on my very personal theology, again, there's so many different views of hope in Christian tradition.
I think I want to take what Reverend Steve did and go maybe a step further. Instead of an alternative to hope, I want to speak in favor of hopelessness and fantasy. And what I mean by that is I think part of the structure of hope is the idea that if I were to confront the fact that things either will or might always be this way, that would be unbearable. And Judaism basically thinks things are always going to be this way, right? The most influential mainstream position about the redeemed world after the Messiah comes is the only change is the restoration of the Jewish people's political sovereignty. There's still going to be intimate violent partner violence. There's still going to be oppression. There will still be judges on the take and corporate corruption and environmental injustice and everything. Like nothing, that's never going to end. And don't try to tell yourself that we can only take this for one lifetime or one generation or one century. Like part of being a grown-up human is like confronting this is as good as it gets. And there's an amazing statement in the Talmud. Rabbi Chia says to his wife, when someone comes to ask for bread at our door, give it to him quickly, so that when our children go to his children's door and our children are begging for bread, his children will give it quickly to ours. And she says, you're cursing our children. And he says, no, there's a wheel of fortune that turns in the world. And it's a play on the biblical verses about tzedakah. There's not a sense of progress. Like we're going to reduce, you're going to give tzedakah and that's going to end poverty, or even reduce it. There's going to be poverty, and the only effect is the world might be a slightly kinder place. But again, it's not a hope, it's a kind of prediction in a sense. And I also want to hold out the sense of fantasy. Like the core, it's an amazing thing about it. In the Bible, the core ritual is sacrifice, right? Like literally it's the center, it's Leviticus. And it's in all the stories. Abraham sacrifices, Moses sacrifices, Noah sacrifices, Cain and Abel sacrifice. The biblical sacrifice is actually it's not about the rules. It's like a very simple idea, right? Bart Giamatti had this idea that games, which sacrifice is, right? It's a magic circle with special rules. Games encode myths. And the myth of sacrifice is to carve out a tiny corner of the world where only the right creatures die at the right times and in the right ways and for the right reasons. And that flies in the face of everything we know about the world and probably everything we can even imagine about the world. But there's this idea that by occasionally, maybe once a year, maybe a few times a life, the word for pilgrimage in biblical Hebrew is the cognative hajj. You enter into a place where that's reality. And it's like a crowbar that lets you hold your soul open, that you can keep that childish dream alive, without necessarily believing it'll come to transpire in the world at whole, with no hope, but with a very, very live fantasy that gives you a different plane to exist on and actually live in and grieve the very stable, very obdurate reality of this world.
I love listening to Rabbi Jason because it always pushes me and it helps sort of, it's like stress testing the things that I hold to be true. This question of witness, I think, is really important. And I think certainly it's important within the Islamic tradition writ large. There is this idea that we are all shuhada, we are all witnessing. And yet, the word shuhada also means martyrs. And for me, that has always been a really powerful connection between the idea of witnessing and the idea of martyrdom. Because the martyr witnesses by engaging their whole being in the act of bringing mercy, compassion, justice to the world, and dies in that process, bearing the ultimate witness to what? Their success or lack of success? Not important, but in the doing of. On Monday, we'll be celebrating and marking and honoring the 58th anniversary of the martyrdom of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, the series of programs. Martyrdom's been on my mind a lot these last few weeks. And I think about folks like Malcolm and their struggle, and that he died at the age of 39 at a critical moment in his work and in the movement for not just black liberation, but what he became to believe was human liberation, centered in black liberation. And yet that has not been achieved, and yet we see him as a witness to that. And I do think the time is coming where there will be witnesses, and there will be martyrs in this moment. Will they move the needle? Don't know. But is that kind of sacrifice needed when the injustice is so great? And what are we witnessing? In one way, what are we reading in the world? And this is another thing, Rabbi Jason, you had shared with me that beautiful anecdote about reciting the Torah, and that if you are distracted by nature, it's something sinful. That really struck me. I've been thinking about that all week, actually, since I saw you at Slivka last week. Because it reminded me that one of the words that describes the verses of the Quran is ayat, signs. And the Quran often reminds us that look to the signs, the ayat, and that creation itself becomes a text. And so I was trying to filter that in my own tradition and saying that, what if someone was reading Revelation and then looked up and saw that creation? And I feel like one of the things, particularly in the Islamic mystical tradition, is that there is a connection between the revelatory text and the text of creation itself. Yeah. And so the idea of witnessing and the idea of becoming a witness is that by immersing ourselves in witnessing creation itself, it's an act of devotion. Yeah. And in that act of devotion, there should develop a call to some kind of khair, good work. or service. And that, in a way, the Quranic text flows in to the text of creation itself. But I think it is fascinating for me, that connection between witness and sacrifice. I think those two things are really connected. And that can be a disturbing thing too. That is a kind of a challenging idea for me, because it involves a lot from us who are claiming to be witnesses on behalf of creation or as part of creation.
I appreciate the question too, thank you, and I appreciate all of these responses. I'll be brief because I'm sure people have other questions as well. But I just want to share that in our Zen Buddhist tradition, our vow is beings are numberless. I vow to save them. That's hopeless. It's absolutely hopeless. There's no possible way that we can save all infinite beings throughout the universe. But we stake our faith on that, and then we move forward with love and compassion. And we also have 3 tenets. The first tenet is not knowing. Not knowing isn't ignorance. Not knowing is approaching each situation that arises freshly and without preconceptions. And in this environmental apocalypse that we're now confronting, it indicates a certain amount of freedom in not holding to hope for particular outcomes, but being flexible and being able to be responsive in that mind of not knowing. The second tenet is bearing witness, a phrase that we've heard several times in the past few minutes. So bearing witness in a way that involves not separating ourselves. And finally, the third tenet is loving action. It's necessary to take responsibility and to take action. In our tradition, it's said that we're responsible for the whole catastrophe. So we take action in whatever way we feel that we're called to do. And we simply hope for the best. And as I say, we move forward with love and with compassion in order to do that.
Hi, thank you all for those beautiful answers. I've been really stuck on this story that Professor Malik shared about planting seeds, even if the trumpets are going to be going. And so I just wanted to ask a question about, for many of our ancestors, right, whether you're thinking about a particular cultural group or religious group, we've experienced things that felt like the end of the world, and in many ways were. We felt the trumpets or heard the trumpet singing, whether it was persecution or enslavement or some sort of displacement or something else that forced us to adapt to grotesque violent situations or new climates or X, Y, and Z. And so I'm wondering, what do you all, what are some of the lessons that you all see as learning from your ancestors' ability, or other groups if it doesn't apply, their ability to keep planting seeds even as the trumpets of the end of the world were going? I'm sorry for the Greek in that question.
Oh, thanks. It's the silence here is a testament to the quality of the question, its depth. It's gotten us all things. So I'll share. I think the fundamental Jewish stance, and this is really the rabbinic tradition, which is the Judaism that we live today, is an ambivalence. And what I mean by that, you know, my therapist is sick of me using that word, but it's warranted here. On the one hand, right, we mourn the destruction of Jerusalem every year, and actually in some ways every day. In the architecture of Jewish homes, you're supposed to leave a segment of the wall unpainted, like bare plaster or drywall. You're supposed to leave something off even your most festive meals menus. You're supposed to kind of never quite be adorned in your full finery because we're still grieving Jerusalem. And the Talmud records an encounter between Rabbi Yoshua and people who were full on grieving Jerusalem, including some members of the rabbinic movement, and said, now, without God's presence in the world, life isn't worth living. We won't eat meat because there was meat offered at the sacrificial table. We won't drink wine because libations of wine were offered. We won't have children anymore because the world isn't a place worth inhabiting. It's very resonant. You read surveys of people thinking about whether to have children nowadays, like something like 5/6 of them report concerns about the climate as a weighty reason not to have children. And yet, if you're Jewish and you're alive today, your ancestors, biological or spiritual, are the people who didn't take that route, who chose only to adorn a corner of their house, barrenly, and not to cease living. And there's a sense to both grieve and to say, you know what? We don't really need that. Rabbinic Judaism is born out of the decision not to keep fighting for Jerusalem, but to surrender it to the Romans in exchange for a small coastal town called Yavne where an academy could be built and a new type of religious life could be set up. And so the second side of the ambivalence is a sense that actually no catastrophe is final. The world really did end with the destruction of the temple and with the Holocaust and with pogroms in many towns over the millennia. And it also continued. And to think about, probably most Jews of the Roman Empire couldn't and didn't want to or felt unfaithful to have moved on from the temple and believed that Judaism was over, and for them it was. And so to be the inheritor of a faith that knows that excessive grief will consume you in its flames, and that grief needs to be moderated is a central part of what I and my community carry today.
Sure, I'll be really short. So I often think about Lazarus because he died and he came back. Jesus called him out. And so in the dying, he wasn't present, but then unbind him, come out into the world. And what was Lazarus' life like after he came out of the tomb? And did he have a new life in Jesus because he saw Jesus when he came out? So for me, that's an image I think about a lot, about when things are dying, what can we unbind from ourselves, and what do we see? And in my understanding, it's the light of Jesus that gives us the hope, even in the death. So there's that story about Lazarus that resonates with climate change and death and resurrection and new life in the human form. So I could talk a lot more about that, but Chris says just a minute. He's purring down there.
This question about the ancestors is so powerful. I've recently been rereading the testimony of Omar ibn Said, who was brought to Charleston in the Carolinas on a slave ship. And he was someone who was versed in Islamic scholarship and knew the Quran off by heart. And after having run away from the first place into which he was enslaved and sold, he found himself on a farm in the rural South in a prison, and he started to write the verses of the Quran that he remembered on the walls of this prison cell. And later on, he was taken into a household and apparently converted to Christianity and asked to write in Arabic a defense of Christianity, and he decided to write his life story interspersed with narrations from the Quran. They didn't know what he was writing. And I think about that story a lot. It's recently been made into a remarkable opera penned by Rhiannon Giddens, who many of you will know. And it's going to be playing in Boston the first week of May and then coming to New York in 2024. It's called Omar, and it's absolutely marvelous. But that story for me is not just a story of resilience. I think we talk about resilience a lot, but it is also about resistance. And it is also knowing that one couldn't return home, that it wasn't about the hope of returning home, but it was the hope of carrying a sense of what was home into your life at this moment. And for this particular personality, Omar ibn Said, it was those sacred texts which he could write in this new land. And it would be sensible to him and to some around him, and that was the place that he drew strength from. And I think there is a kind of an estrangement we have. I think migration, enslavement, the refugee crisis leaves us estranged and strange. And yet, my tradition says to me, this tradition came as something strange, it'll leave as something strange. Be like someone who is traveling, who stops under the shade of a tree for a few moments, the prophet said, and then moves on. So this is our moment under the tree. Maybe we can hear what the tree is saying. We have a moment in this time to create, but knowing that our home is with the divine actually gives us a sense of urgency, I think, that this time is limited. It's short. How many breaths do we have? How many days are ahead of us? That recent book that talked about 4,000 weeks. We start breaking our lives down in that way. So how do we capture from our ancestors how they dealt with that sense of urgency? I think that for me maybe holds some of the secret.
These are such beautiful, beautiful answers. I will just say quickly that in the Chan and Zen Buddhist tradition, the ancestors are very, very much alive with us. Every time I sit down on the meditation cushion, I'm very aware that the ancestors are sitting with me. And it's an unbroken lineage of over 1,500 years from teacher to student, all these men and women passing the heart tradition down to us. And within that lineage of ancestors, there's a very, very strong tradition of communion with nature. It comes out of Taoism in China, but it's a very strong tradition of mountains and rivers. And we also have a strong tradition of the teachings of Buddha nature are expressed through all beings, including those that are generally considered to be insentient, including the stones, including the rivers, which in fact are not insentient at all. Everything is sentient. Everything is full of Buddha nature. So the ancestors and the sentient beings are all with us at all times. And I think that really informs a Buddhist approach to this environmental crisis.
So one thing I'm learning today is that this panel could have been 3 hours long. I'm sorry to be the referee here and cut us off, but this is the closing of the panel, so can we have a round of applause?